What happens when the very person the Navy once cast aside becomes the only one who can save their most advanced destroyer? A cutting-edge U.S. Navy destroyer unexpectedly went dead in the water just days before a top-secret mission. Their best engineers were stumped. Then, a name thought erased from the records a veteran once discarded was summoned back. He didn't just fix the engines, he righted an injustice. This story will make you reconsider honor, silence, and the power of a long-overdue apology. If you believe in the strength of a comeback, hit like and subscribe. Small actions that can make a big difference. Joe Hargrove lives in an old garage at the end of Ferry Cutoff Road, right on the banks of the Christina River. The warehouse was once a maintenance station for fishing boats in the 1960s. Now only dried oil stains cling to the concrete floor, the windows are fogged, and the corrugated metal walls are rusted. There's no sign, no mailbox, just a single yellow bulb hanging by the door, glowing each night like a quiet heartbeat reminding you this place is still alive. He lives alone. No wife, no nearby children, no dogs or cats, only old engines, technical manuals, a few cans of beans, and the soft hum of an AM radio each morning. In winter, he builds a fire from sawdust in a steel drum. In summer, he throws open the doors to let in the river breeze, carrying salt and distant freight ship whistles. Joe was once a top mechanical officer in the U.S. Navy. His name was on the list of strategic engine consultants, responsible for the complex systems aboard Los Angeles-class submarines. Then one unexpected accident extinguished that career. A technical fault left the main engine of an experimental submarine dead in the middle of the Atlantic. The investigation was swift. Someone had to take the fall. And Joe, with his prematurely graying head, his pride, and one unfinished report, became the scapegoat. No court, no hearing, just a closed-door meeting and a discharge order. He left the base on a drizzly morning, carrying his toolbox, a modest severance package, and a cold silence that lasted nearly 30 years. Since then, he has lived as if time itself had stopped. Fishermen along the Delaware shore know him as the old engine fixer, the man who can make any engine breathe again just by listening to its tremors. Joe doesn't use electronic gauges. His ears, the ones accustomed to the turbine shaft's vibration, are the most accurate instruments. "I hear machines the way people hear heartbeats," he once told a curious neighbor boy. That boy, now grown, still repeats that line with quiet reverence. He has no close friends, yet he is not lonely. Some boat captains will drive all the way from Pennsylvania just to have him listen to their motors. No one knows his exact age. Joe seems not to age. Only his eyes deepen with time, and his skilled hands remain perpetually stained with grease. That afternoon, the Delaware sky was heavy with dampness, low clouds rolling silently over the river. Joe was wiping down a screwdriver, sleeves rolled high, when the gravel outside the garage door crunched. A black, unmarked SUV pulled up, and a plainclothes naval officer stepped out. He offered no preamble, just a badge, Navy, Technical Division, and a terse line, "We need you." Joe stared at him wordlessly for a few seconds. Then he nodded, as if that decision had been waiting inside him for years. He wiped his hands on a rag, slipped the little brass bar into his shirt pocket, and shut the garage door behind him. No farewells, no locks. Just once more, he set off carrying himself, a man once forgotten, now summoned back not for his past, but because no one else can do what he is about to do. When Joe stepped down from the SUV at the main gate of Naval Base Norfolk, his worn shoes met the cold, damp concrete with a soft click. No one came out to greet him. Only the sea breeze swept through, carrying the scent of salt and the distant echo of freighter horns. Nearly 30 years had passed, yet everything here seemed unchanged. Barbed wire fences still lined the perimeter, towering antenna masts punctuated the skyline, and gray concrete blocks stood silent as though they had never witnessed anyone being forgotten. But the way people looked was different. As Joe passed through the checkpoint, a group of young engineers paused, whispering behind his back. "Who's that?" one muttered, coffee cup in hand. No one answered. No need. His battered toolbox, peeling paint, and aged brass bar spoke for themselves. He no longer belonged here. Not in uniform, no badge. Just an old man moving slowly through the technical area, carrying a past long unmentioned. To them, he was like a piece of rusted metalance, vital, once gleaming, now redundant. The engine workshop for the destroyer was a vast metal structure, its high ceiling bathed in cold white light that reflected off the polished concrete floor. At its center lay the Zumwalt's main engine stripped down to its frame and wiring, like a heart exposed on an operating table. Surrounding it were control panels, diagnostic equipment, and screens displaying vibration waveforms, temperature readouts, and resonance frequencies. Joe paused at the threshold for several seconds. He did not look at anyone, only at the engine. His body remained almost motionless, but something in his eyes shifted, as though he was seeing not what lay before him but what lay within. Then he raised his hand, his calloused palm opening in a decisive gesture. "Silence," he said, his voice deep, firm not as a command, but as a necessity. A few people chuckled quietly, others shook their heads. But the presence of Admiral Callahan standing behind them, merely nodding once, drew all sound into silence. Joe walked toward the engine. Each step echoed on the workshop floor like a drumbeat, recalling memories. He placed the brass bar against the casing, pressed his ear to the other end. His whole body bent forward, as if paying homage to something sacred. Then he closed his eyes. His breaths flowed slowly. No one in the room dared move. Some held their breath. A young engineer glanced at the vibration monitor. Nothing unusual registered. Yet Joe remained perfectly still, as though he was listening not with his ears but with every year of his life. This was no longer an old riverside garage on the Christina, no longer tin cans or a crackling AM radio each morning. In that moment, he was once again Officer Hargrove, the man who read an errant turbine vibration with a fingertip, the man who once halted a midnight repair because he sensed the engine's uneven breath. Minutes slipped by. Joe opened his eyes. He looked at no one. He simply said, almost exhaling, "Shaft misalignment. Resonance is causing a torsional vibration at high speed. It doesn't show up on circuit diagrams, it's not in the sensors. But it's herein the slight jerk during the last 0.087 of a second of each rotation." A hush settled again. Then a faint clangone of the young engineers had dropped his screwdriver. Not from shock, but from the realization that some things cannot be read by machines. Joe lifted his toolbox and turned away, exiting without explanation or waiting for anyone to stop him. To him, the diagnosis was complete. And as before, he demanded no recognition. Only this time, the looks following him were no longer doubtful. They were respectful, mixed with something, almost remorse. Afternoon fell like a thin blanket over the riverside town. A breeze swept across the Christina River, carrying along dry leaves and riverside dust. Joe stood alone in the garage's backyard, hands deeply buried in his coat pockets, eyes quietly fixed on the slow-moving water. Nothing was urgent. Just like his life, quiet, enduring, and requiring no witness. His phone vibrated in his pocket, signaling an incoming call. The screen displayed an unfamiliar yet somehow familiar number, Norfolk's area code. Joe slowly lifted it to his ear. "Mr. Hargrove?" A voice came over the line, this time no longer flippant but with a note of subdued respect. "This is Simmons, lead engineer at Norfolk." Joe remained silent. He let the other speak first, a habit from his service years, not out of distrust, but out of respect for the weight of every word. "We've just run the laser alignment on the drive shaft. Exactly as you said. The error lies in that final segment of the cycle, enough to induce resonant vibration. Once at speed, the shock exceeds safe limits and throws the entire drivetrain out of alignment. The shaft is indeed misaligned." A pause followed, not to await a reply, but because Simmons knew Joe was listening not with his ears, but with all he'd seen and borne. "We are proceeding with realigning the axis orientation and adjusting the tilt, based on your recommendation." Joe did not respond immediately. He merely raised an eyebrow, watching the last light glinting on the river's surface. The wind stirred up from the water's edge. The Christina flowed on as it always had, not for him, not for anyone. Yet today, for Joe, it felt like an answer. "Thank you, sir," Simmons added, his voice lower now, as if he owed a debt. "I just thought you should know." Joe offered no good luck, and spoke no other word. He only gave a slight nod, as if Simmons could see it through the phone line, then hung up. He turned and walked inside, placing the phone on the workbench beside the can of machine oil and the old AM radio. The fluorescent lights overhead continued to flicker, pulsing as if trying to say something. But he paid them no mind. At Naval Station Norfolk, Admiral Callahan received Simmons' report. He was not surprised. He narrowed his eyes behind his thin-framed glasses as he absorbed the technical details. Not because of the mechanics, but because he knew this moment had been coming. He summoned his aide and ordered, "Call Mr. Hargrove back. Tell him I want him back at the base tomorrow." The aide hesitated. "Sir, he's no longer on active duty. If we want to bring him back, we'll need." Callahan waved his hand. "I don't need him to sign anything. I need him here. And if we need an excuse, say this is an invitation from an old comrade, someone who owes him the truth." In the dim yellow light of the small riverside room, Joe prepared a simple dinner, a slice of bread, a can of beans, and a cup of hot tea. But he did not eat. The plate remained untouched on the table. He sat motionless, eyes fixed out the window where mist was creeping across the river's surface. He knew what was coming, not another mission, not commendations, but the moment he had waited for all his life, not to be forgiven, but to be heard and believed again. A phone call, a nod, a return not to start over, but to finally close a chapter that had never been laid to rest. And in the backyard, under the gathering dusk, Joe Hargrove quietly cleaned his trusty drift punch with an old rag. His hand trembled ever so slightly, yet his gaze was steady, as though he already knew the direction in which the shaft of his life was being realigned. Dear viewers, please take a moment to relax or pour yourself a drink, then stay tuned for the next unexpected chapter. Comment 1 if this story moved you, so we know you're still with us. It was still not fully light when the military helicopter touched down on the rear landing pad of Naval Station Norfolk. The rotor blades thumped like a solemn drumbeat, not raucous, but reverent. Joe disembarked, toolbox clutched in his hand, his old dark jacket hanging heavy on his frame. But this time, there was something different in his posture. He was no longer the man summoned as a last-ditch fix, but the man returning as an indispensable part of the Hulia, living witness to that which both time and the naval bureaucracy once tried to forget, the truth. Along the long steel corridor where young officers stood at attention, their eyes no longer smirked. They stood rigid, as if by reflex before a rank no paperwork could convey. Some averted their gaze as Joe passed, some offered a subtle nod. No one spoke, yet the atmosphere had shifted from doubt to respect, from silence to attentive listening. Inside the command center, Admiral Callahan waited. He wore no dress uniform, no ribbons, only a plain jacket, and eyes heavy with unspoken words. Joe entered. The two men faced each other. There was no formal greeting, no military flourish, just a look, lingering and sincere. "Joe," Callahan began, "thank you for coming back." Joe gave a slight nod. He didn't need thanks, but he heard them. Callahan moved to the desk and picked up a thick file in a gray paper cover, old but freshly bound. He extended it toward Joe. "This is the full re-evaluation of that incident. I ordered a review of all operating data, the original reports, and eyewitness statements." He paused, then spoke deliberately, as if each word had traveled a long distance. "We were wrong to dismiss you." Joe said nothing. But his eyes flickered with emotion, a nameless feeling passing through him, neither triumph nor relief, but a quiet acceptance after so many years of being unheard. "You flagged the misalignment risk," Callahan continued. "Your report was shelved for bureaucratic reasons, but our latest analysis confirms you were absolutely right. There is no evidence of technical negligence on your part." Callahan set the file down. "We apologize. I apologize." The silence in the room deepened. There was nothing left to prove. Yet Joe's very presence, how he stood still, gazing straight ahead made that apology feel more genuine than any official document. A junior officer stepped in, carrying a white envelope. Inside was the confirmation of consultancy work and a formal honorarium settlement. Joe did not open it. He simply laid his hand on the envelope and gave a nod. For him, this return could not be measured in money. Simmons was also present. His usual tension had been replaced by something quieter gratitude and a touch of remorse. He approached Joe, his voice low and sincere. "I once thought I knew everything about that engine, but yesterday, you showed me that sometimes, silence is the most powerful language." Joe smiled for the first time that day. Not broadly, not triumphantly, but enough to soften the entire atmosphere. Callahan stepped forward and offered his hand. "You were never anything less than part of us, Joe." Their hands clasped in a belated handshake, but not too late. Honor, at last, had been named. No longer buried in dusty files or lost in outdated procedures. As Joe walked out of the room, the light outside had grown brighter. The young officers still stood, none turning away. They watched him as one might behold a true monument not made of bronze or stone, but of integrity and time. From this moment on, honor would no longer remain silent. When the tense atmosphere had been replaced by something almost serene, Simmons stepped forward. In his hand he held a thick leather-bound notebook, embossed with the Navy seal in one corner. The scent of fresh paper mingled with the faint tang of technical ink, as if to blend with the dust of old experience that Joe carried with him. Simmons paused before him, no longer the chief engineer but a disciple in search of something greater than mere solutions. He extended the notebook, his voice low and slightly hesitant. "Sir, could you fill this out for us? The system still has some ambiguities in the updated manual. I think, with your signature and guidance." Joe took the notebook. The leather cover warmed under his palm, as though the book itself were breathing. He flipped through a few pages, diagrams, instructions, symbols, and specifications catching his eye. Then he smiled, a deep, gentle smile that carried the weight of many years. "I can," he said. His tone carried no hint of pride. It sounded like an answer he was giving to himself after decades of being denied. But then he snapped the notebook shut and handed it back to Simmons. "But let you learn." Those words, in the engine room still redolent of machine oil, swept through the ranks of young engineers standing nearby like a fresh breeze. No one spoke. Yet each person understood that what Joe was passing on could not be written in a manual, nor easily looked up in a digital database. Simmons accepted the notebook with both hands, as though receiving an unspoken charge. In that moment, between them there was no longer merely a mistake being corrected, but a generation being entrusted with a way of life meticulous, humble, and empathetic. Joe turned toward the workbench, where the main engine had just been reassembled. A group of young technicians were performing the final checks. Their steps were still slightly tentative, but something had shifted. They listened more attentively, worked more carefully, as though they'd just learned a new language, a language not found in any textbook. He walked over to a young man adjusting the pressure valve. Without a word, he rested a hand on the youth's shoulder for a second, then gave a slight nod. It was acknowledgement too ostentatious, yet enough to make that young man stand a little taller. Behind them, Simmons remained still. He watched Joe's every move, then found himself speaking up. "Mr. Hargrove, if you have the time, I think my team would like to hear more. Not just about the engine but about how you know, how you read the sounds, how you sense the misalignment." Joe turned back, his eyes softened. The words, "how you sense," made him pause for a moment. Then he nodded. "There's no secret. It's just that, when you live long enough with things that breathe, that vibrate, that remain silent, you learn to recognize when they need to speak." The engine room fell utterly silent in that instant. Everyone realized they were not merely being taught a skill, they had been shown a way of life, an attitude, a philosophy that no modern machine can replace. Simmons stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "I think you've forgiven already, but I still want to say thank you. Not just for the diagnosis, but for the way you came back." Joe did not answer immediately. He gazed out the small window, where midday light slanted through the metal slats. Then he turned back, placing a hand on Simmons's shoulder. "You don't need my forgiveness. You just need to keep listening." He paused, then pulled from his coat pocket a small copper rod, darkened with age, and placed it in Simmons's hand. "Hold on to this, not to measure with it but to remind you that some things require you to press your ear very close to hear them." Once more, he turned and walked away, not to depart, but to clear space for those about to step forward. In that silence, the young men stood a little taller. They no longer saw just an old man leaving the room. They had been entrusted with something no technical manual can contain: honor, preserved through the act of listening. Joe did not return to Delaware by helicopter. Instead, the Navy arranged a small boat to take him down Chesapeake Bay and then along the Christina River. It was his own suggestion, not because he feared heights, but because he needed time to be still, to think, and to watch the river flow just as the years of his life had been, silent, steadfast, demanding no witness. On the deck, Joe leaned against the railing, collar turned up, eyes following the water. The river said nothing. Yet he saw himself in every ripple, every low-sweeping gull, every bend of the shore. He had once believed that if one day he were vindicated, he would feel relieved. But now what he felt was not relief, but a profound emptiness, as if silence had dwelt with him so long that even the most heartfelt apology would register merely as a faint sound in a space accustomed to none. After nearly 2 hours, the boat tied up at the wooden pier behind the old garage. Delaware's afternoon sky was not sunny, but it was bright. Stepping ashore with his familiar toolbox, Joe's boots creaked on the planks. He looked up and froze. His daughter stood at the garage door. She said nothing. She did not step forward. She simply stood there, hands loosely clasped, her gaze meeting his without flinching, yet carrying something ancient, a question never once permitted to be spoken. Joe remained still. The river breeze ruffled his coat. His heart slowed, then stabbed at him, not from surprise, but from all the unspoken things. The day she left, they had argued. She had accused him of living too much in the past, off, clinging to bolts and memories as if they could change anything. He said nothing in response. He simply carried on in the garage with his old radio and the boat engine. From that day on, they spoke no more. But today, she was here, watching him, neither angry nor reproachful. Just her presence, enough to pierce him with something he thought he had lost long ago, being needed, not for his skill, but for being a father. She took a few steps closer, then stopped. "I heard," they apologized, she said, her voice low and trembling like leaves brushing in the wind. Did you finally hear it clearly?" Joe said nothing. He simply nodded. A slight nod, yet heavy as a confession. Not the sound of a machine this time, but the voice of family. And for the first time in many years, he felt he was no longer alone. They stood there, on the old wooden dock. No one stepped forward to embrace. No tears, no belated apologies, just presence. And that was enough to start again, quietly but firmly, just as Joe had always listened to engines, patient, unobtrusive, simply close enough to hear the most honest truth. That evening, the yellow light in the garage glowed as it did every night. But this time, there were 2 shadows inside, one old, one young. His daughter silently wiped down the workbench, while Joe inspected the spark assembly for a lawnmower. They spoke little, but now and then she looked up at him, and each time he caught her gaze, he would smile, gently. Yet truly, outside, the waters of the Christina River continued to flow, no longer carrying unspoken words, but carrying away what had just been forgiven. Joe did not need to win a lawsuit or reclaim his former post. He did not require any further honors. What he needed at last had arrived. Someone willing to listen, a loved one returned, and a path that did not lead him back to fame but back to himself. And that was something no wind could ever extinguish. There are small sounds in life: the misalignment of a shaft, a sigh unheard, an apology that comes too late, but if you listen closely enough, they can change everything. Joe Hargrove's story is not just about restored honor, but something deeper. The silent steadfastness and the power of forgiveness, not because others deserve it, but because we deserve the release of that burden. Each of us will, at some point, be misunderstood, forgotten, or carry something left unsaid. But what matters is not how long someone listens to us, but that when someone finally does listen, we still have the calm to nod instead of shout. If you have ever lived with something unexplained, if you have ever borne a heavy silence, then this story is for you. Thank you for watching to the end. If this story touched you, please click like so we know you're here. Subscribe so you don't miss our next true life stories. And if you have ever had a Joe in your life or you are that person, share your thoughts in the comments. We are here to listen, because sometimes just having someone who will listen is enough to heal a lifetime.